Welcome to week 10, chapter 14. This week we are taking a departure from Keynesian economics, and we're going to work a little bit with the neoclassical perspective. So the neoclassical perspective is based on the classical economics perspective that supply creates its own demand. Basically, the idea that wages and prices are not sticky and that the economy can come out of a recession or curb inflationary pressures on its own without the aid of government intervention. So Keynes believed that intervention by the government was necessary to cure recessions or curb inflation. This was due to sticky wages and prices and low effective aggregate demand. So in the Keynesian model, So in a Keynesian model, when firms produced goods and services and they were not selling and inventories were building up, this situation could occur indefinitely. That even if the firm were to cut prices, they might not be able to cut wages on their workers. And if they cut prices on their inventories, the inventory of goods and services that they have produced and not yet sold, they would not always sell those goods and services. There would be persistent unemployment in excess of the natural rate of unemployment. This was also because consumers So the most important thing to note is that the economy could lack significant aggregate demand, and lacking significant aggregate demand meant that we would never reach our potential real GDP, our full employment real GDP, and unemployment would be in excess of the natural rate of unemployment. So when firms produced goods and services and they did not sell and inventories built up, this situation could occur indefinitely. Inventory buildup would signal that firms should fire or let go of employees or simply not hire, and that they should also This would result in persistent unemployment in excess of the natural rate of unemployment. Consumers would not buy the lower priced inventory of goods and services because they were hesitant to spend in a recessionary environment. Therefore, the economy lacked significant aggregate demand and it could remain there indefinitely. But neoclassical economics was more concentrated on the idea that growth is really a result of changes in aggregate supply, not in changes in aggregate demand. So recollect that aggregate demand is all of the consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports that are occurring in an economy. They believed that wages and prices were flexible. So the neoclassical or classical economics view was that if inventories were to build up for some reason, this would make firms concerned because they don't want to have inventories of unsold goods and services building up. What they would do in reaction to inventory buildup would be to reduce the wages that they pay to their employees and also reduce the prices of their unsold inventory goods and services. When they did this, people would buy the cheaper inventories, and when inventories fall, this is a signal to firms to begin producing more goods and services, and they will hire people again to work to produce them. So this could all cure the recession. And therefore we did not need government intervention. And the key here being that wages and prices are flexible and there is sufficient aggregate demand. Therefore, government should focus on policies which increase long-run growth and reduce potential inflation. We do not need to be so concerned about unemployment resulting from insufficient short-term aggregate demand. Neoclassical perspective, our aggregate supply curve is vertical. If you recollect where we looked at our aggregate demand and aggregate supply model before we focused on just the Keynesian or neoclassical perspective, the aggregate supply curve had three sections: the horizontal or Keynesian section, the intermediary section, and the vertical section, which is the classical section. So the neoclassical economist believes that really the most important thing that can happen is to have government policies which seek to increase the aggregate supply curve, which would therefore, when it intersects with aggregate demand, cause an increase in real GDP. So initially, let's assume that we're in a situation where we are at AD1 and AS1. So at this initial aggregate demand and aggregate supply, we would have real GDP as represented by the intersection of those two curves in this amount. Now, let's say, for example, that there is some sort of event which causes an increase in consumption. Let's say that there's an increase in confidence by consumers that they will be receiving raises in the next year. So they increase their consumption now. And when they increase their consumption now, aggregate demand shifts from AD1 to AD2. When aggregate demand shifts from AD2, we notice that for a short period of time, we're actually producing above our potential real GDP, as represented by the intersection of AS1, aggregate supply curve 1, and our new aggregate demand curve that shifted because of an increase in consumption. Now, why would this happen? How is it possible that we can produce a level of real GDP that is greater than our potential as represented by the vertical line AS, our long-run aggregate supply? Well, it can happen for a couple of reasons. Perhaps people will work harder and more hours. Perhaps they will work overtime. When they do this, they're able to produce for a short period of time more real GDP than is potentially available in the economy given the available land, labor, resources, and technology. But they can't do this forever. And when they begin to do this, to work overtime, to work longer and harder, even more efficiently to produce more and more goods and services because that's what's demanded, firms see that they have to actually increase the workers that they have on staff to produce goods and services. So they increase hiring. And in order to entice people to join their firm, they might have to pay higher wages. And when they pay these higher wages, we see that wages in the entire economy can actually go up. When wages in the entire economy go up, we know that this can shift the aggregate supply inward. Why does this shift aggregate supply inward? Well, wages are the price of labor. And labor is a major component to the production costs of a firm. So therefore, when a major input we see that when a major input price increases, it could be the price of raw materials, but here it's the price of labor. This will reduce aggregate supply at every level of real GDP. So for a very short period of time, we're producing real GDP in excess of our potential real GDP as represented by AS, our long run aggregate supply, and we're actually going to be producing above our potential. But it won't happen long, and it won't happen for very long because prices for labor will increase, and when wages, the input labor price increases, this will shift our aggregate supply curve to the left because labor is an important component of the cost of production. So aggregate supply then shifts back up and to the left, and we will be producing the same level of real GDP, but at a higher price. So the only cost or the only effect of increases in aggregate demand in the long run to the economy is higher prices. They have to be accompanied by a shifting of the long run average supply curve in order to actually affect real GDP. So this is not the longest lecture. I do urge you to take a look at the Phillips curve if you have time. But it's just important to understand that there is a significance between what Keynes advocated and what the Neoclassical economics school advocated. And Keynes really advocated for government intervention in fiscal and monetary policy to cure recessions or curb inflation, whereas neoclassical economics prescribed that government policy should focus on increasing long-run growth and reducing potential inflation. So the conclusions of these two schools are very different in terms of how they function, because one really just seeks to increase long-run growth and reduce potential inflation, and the other advocates for government intervention to cure recessions. Neoclassical economics believing that recessions or inflation would cure themselves. So please contact me if you have any questions on this lesson. I urge you to read the chapter very carefully, and good luck